It's not just history that shapes our nation. Our story is rooted in the fact that we're an island surrounded by the oceans. There's an extra spring in my step because we're on the last leg of our epic journey around the entire coastline of the UK. A breathtaking landscape, nearly 12,000 miles in length and comprising 6,000 islands, our coast is one of the most diverse and magnificent in the world. And the last 300 or so miles take us from the striped cliffs of Hunstanton all the way round to our setting off point, the White Cliffs of Dover. It's a coast that for thousands of years has witnessed that ongoing tug of war between our land and the ravages of the sea. A coastline that's evolving before your very eyes. To help me explore these volatile shores, I'm joined by the usual suspects. Discovering how Britain became an island is anthropologist Alice Roberts. Archaeologist Mark Horton explores the humble beach hut and asks why. Historian Neil Oliver celebrates one of the unsung heroes of the Battle of Trafalgar. And I investigate our worst natural disaster in living memory. It's dangerous, unpredictable and spectacular. Brace yourselves, this is Coast. The last leg of our journey runs around 300 miles, from Hunstanton in the Wash, round the huge sweeping arc of East Anglia, across the Thames estuary to the place where I began, at Dover. Be careful about putting your faith in maps. They give the impression of a fixed coastline, but it's being reshaped faster than we realise. Not just the gradual reshaping that occurs over geological time, there are dramatic changes that happen every day with every high tide. And nowhere more so than out here, on the east coast. Take the red and white chalk cliffs at Hunstanton. Chalk is actually the compressed corpses of tiny warm water organisms, which proves that this layer was once the seabed of a tropical ocean. Over geological time, it moved from the tropics and was pushed up from the ocean floor. But now these cliffs are crumbling away, the sea's reclaiming them. It's a process of constant change. And that's the story of this leg of our journey. To walk this stretch of the east coast is to witness the huge geographical processes which continually remake our shores and reshape our communities. Norfolk. Big skies, broad fields and sandy beaches. The quaint villages that pepper the North Norfolk Coast Road have a tale to tell of how changes along the coast can make or break whole communities. This is Cley next to sea, a village in breach of the Trades Description Act, because the only waves you'll find here are the ones in the hairdressers. But it wasn't always so. Around 500 years ago, it had a busy harbour big enough to accommodate trading ships from all over Europe. For Cley, the coast meant wealth. You can see it written into the stonework of the local churches. They're symbols of robust prosperity, places where you could meet God and show off your fine carvings and fancy flint work at the same time. Trade was going so well that by the 13th century, nearby Norwich had become the country's second city. But by the beginning of the 1600s, it was all but gone. The wealth, the trade, the big ships. The coastline had moved, leaving all those prosperous ports high and dry.
Well, this village green is a triangular-shaped inlet which came off the large estuary, and that estuary would have flooded with water every high tide, several miles inland. It was quite an enormous estuary, really, with the port of Cley on this side, and on the west side you've got the port of Wiverton. You can see Wiverton Church in the background there, and behind us, on the northern end of the estuary, Blakeney Church as well.
You're saying this sleepy village green was once chock-a-block with shipping?
It would have started that way, certainly, yes. Ships would have been beached here, unloaded. They would have had ships being constructed and repaired.
The three churches belonging to Cley, Wiverton and Blakeney mark the furthest reaches of this former estuary. But after 400 years of successful trading, the changes along this coast brought about the port's demise. Just a mile and a half offshore from Cley is Blakeney Point, a shingle spit that has slowly extended 4 miles west, cutting off the village's inland from access to the sea.
The spit grew further westwards, which to start with was very good for the port because it afforded a lot of protection from the northerly gales. Behind this, salt marsh would grow up. Local landowners started buying it and seeing potential profit there, and so lots of it was reclaimed as grazing land and arable land. This prevented the tide from flooding it, and the channels gradually got narrower and shallower, and that really put paid to Cley as an international trading port.
The spit at Blakeney has been growing for over 1,000 years by a process called longshore drift. Longshore drift is a classic example of coastal geography. Driven by the strong prevailing northeasterly winds, the waves hit the shore obliquely. Each wave picks up a handful of shingle and moves it a bit further along the coast. Over time, all the shingle builds up into long ridges or spits, which run almost parallel to land, but just offshore. All the way along the east coast, the shingle spit is a common feature. New land slowly forming from sediments dumped by the sea. But a couple of miles on at Weybourne, the whole process is operating in reverse. This very spot is where everything changes for North Norfolk. That way where I've come from, sand and shingle are being dumped by the tons. But that way where we're heading, the cliffs erupt from the shoreline and tell a far more terrifying story: erosion. From this point on, the soft cliffs are being eaten away. Every tide nibbling at a landmass that has taken millions of years to create. There's nothing new about erosion. A decade ago, these cliffs jutted much further out into the sea. But thousands of years ago, the coast didn't just look different, there was no coast here. Tracking down the vanishing sea, our anthropologist Alice Roberts is in Cromer.
Think of Cromer, and it's likely you'll think of Cromer crabs. But for me, this Victorian seaside resort is the first chapter of a much bigger coastal story.
The North Norfolk coastline is very distinctive, the way it sort of bulges out into the North Sea. And it's along this coastline that we find evidence for how and when Britain became an island, and actually, very excitingly, when that was.
For the answer, we have to go back in time to what we broadly call the Ice Age. For 700,000 years, massive ice sheets up to a mile thick have come and gone across Britain, moving slowly down from Scotland and carving the landmass as they travelled. Along the way, they swept up rocks, crunching them up as they slipped southwards. At one point, the ice sheets began to melt as they approached the North Norfolk coast, and even today we can still see evidence in the landscape.
Now, Cromer is a seaside town, much like any other. It's got seafront hotels, we've got the pier here. What I'm really interested in are the hills in the distance over there, because whereas most of Norfolk is of course flat, those hills are particularly interesting because they were formed by the edge of the ice sheet.
All the crumbled rock it carried within it was dumped in a long line at the point where the ice melted.
All of these hills are what's left behind.
But these hefty ice sheets did much more than carve mountains and create hillsides. They changed the position of the entire east coastline. Evidence for the transformation lies under the waters of the North Sea. I'm heading out with geologist Peter Balson, whose job it is to know what's happening on the ocean floor.
We need to understand the geological conditions on the seabed in order to place structures such as these windmills we see around us. These are just things that you can see. Below us there are cables, pipelines, telecommunications cables, power cables, all sorts of infrastructure actually on the seabed.
Core samples taken from the floor of the North Sea reveal how the last ice age completely changed the shape of Britain.
We can see this dark brown peat layer, which was deposited in a marsh environment which existed in this area between about 11,000 and 9,000 years ago.
Right. Well, hang on a minute, because you're saying this is a marsh environment. It's peat, so it's fresh water, but this is what is now underneath the North Sea.
Yes, in fact, this core was taken from about 35 metres water depth in the North Sea.
Peat can only be formed on land in freshwater marshes. Finding this peat layer proves that the North Sea must once have been dry land. Carbon dating suggests the peat is around 11,000 years old, from the tail end of the last ice age.
Why was the sea level so low at that point?
During the maximum period of glaciation, the global sea level might have been up to 120 metres below the present day. That's because of the amount of water that's been locked away inside these ice caps.
How extensive was this area of exposed land?
This area of land at this time was very extensive in the southern North Sea. The area we're talking about stretches from right the way across North Norfolk to Holland. And all of this area here would have been this sort of lowland, marshy area that you could imagine that animals and human beings could have crossed this area, and that's why it's known as a land bridge.
So we were joined to mainland Europe by a temporary bridge of land that would have come and gone with changes in climate, and it's all still there under the North Sea. Deep freeze cold snaps have happened many times over the last 700,000 years. During each cold period, water was locked up as ice, causing sea levels to fall and exposing new areas of land that connected us to Europe. Animal bones dredged up from the North Sea reveal a lost world we wouldn't recognise today. At times a barren tundra, at others a sloppy marshland populated with elephants, hippos and rhinos. At Gressenhall Museum there's a vast repository of these exotic animal bones.
This is a rhino skull that was dredged off the coast of Yarmouth about 100 years ago, I believe. This was our indigenous fauna during the ice ages. We had woolly rhino, woolly mammoth, reindeer, not so exotic.
Yeah.
But at other times, during warmer periods, we did have much more exotic sounding creatures. We had things like hippos.
Really?
They lived here during a warmer period, during which time we hardly had any land bridge at all. And then after that, there came the ice ages again, and they became extinct locally.
Right.
And of course, it's not just animals that have been found under the North Sea. We've got evidence of humans. I have here the remains of a harpoon. This is about 12,000 years old. It's been carbon dated. And this is a harpoon made out of a type of deer antler, we think, that's been cut and carved and polished.
So when was this found?
This was found by a trawler in about 1931.
It's got engravings on it.
Yeah, it's got cut marks down the side. Whether those are tally marks or something, I don't know.
Like, these are the number of walruses that I've killed this year, sort of thing.
This relates to humans arriving in this area, and this is after the cold period.
Right.
It's much warmer. We have plant species recolonising this area, followed by animal species, followed by the hunters of those animals, maybe migrating backwards and forwards with the seasons, and then suddenly, 8,000 years ago, we're an island again.
The evidence from under the sea proves there was a land bridge which allowed animals and our ancestors to walk back into Britain after the coldest periods of the last ice age. A few more thousand years of melting ice and rising sea levels, and the land bridge disappeared under the sea, and we began our adventure as an island people. When you take this long view,
you suddenly see how things which you take for granted as being permanent are actually really dynamic and changing. And if we can try and understand the factors that affect the changing coastline in the past, then that gives us the tools for predicting the changes that will happen in the future.
Unlike our ancestors, modern-day coastal dwellers have tried to hold back the power of nature. In Haysborough, they're losing the battle, and the villagers are clinging to their homes for as long as they can. But at Sea Palling, these man-made granite reefs are designed to dissipate the destructive energy of the sea. If erosion wasn't bad enough, there's another threat to contend with here. The Norfolk Broads could have been custom built for messing about on boats. In fact, the system of freshwater channels is the happy result of peat excavations in the Middle Ages. But because they're so low-lying and so close to the sea, they're at risk of being flooded permanently. This is West Somerton, my favourite place on the Norfolk Broads. I grew up in Norfolk and spent a good bit of my childhood pottering around in canoes and sailing boats. Now I've got my own children, I come here every year with them. The water's absolutely beautiful. And this is about as close as the Norfolk Broads get to the open sea, where the fresh water almost touches the salt water. It's a very fragile coexistence. Sea levels are rising, making the low-lying Broads increasingly vulnerable to a flood of seawater. And that would mean disaster for this finely tuned freshwater habitat. The Broads could be turned into a massive saltwater estuary. Just look at that. This narrow ridge of sand is all that's separating the North Sea from this vast tract of East Norfolk's farmland, villages and roads. The sea's broken through here before, and since then this row of sand dunes has been strengthened with concrete walls. When the sea does break through here, it can travel for about 5 miles in less than half an hour, and that's because this land is sloping down in that direction. All the rivers flow that way, away from the sea, then round in a huge curve out to Great Yarmouth. They don't go that way, they take the long route. So this sea defence here is absolutely critical. The only way of preventing the sea breaking through here again is by constant maintenance. That maintenance is keeping the defences intact. For the moment, the lowlands are safe. Our whole coastal landscape is interlinked. Sediments lost to erosion are thrown back up further south. You can see this where the Norfolk Broads meet the sea at Great Yarmouth. In Roman times, there was no land here at all, but longshore drift dragged out this long tongue of land that the town now sits on. A rung or two up the social ladder from Great Yarmouth and 11 miles further south is Lowestoft. It's the most easterly point of the entire UK, teetering on the edge of the gigantic curve of the East Anglian coastline. It's also a hotspot for a very English obsession, the beach hut. Our very English archaeologist, Mark Horton, is there.
At Lowestoft, you can't actually buy a beach hut, but you can rent one of 230 owned by the council. But the waiting list is 12 years. Why on earth would you actually want one? There are 20,000 beach huts on our coastline, and I have to admit they're colourful. But with no electricity or running water, it's hard to see why they're still so popular. Architectural historian Dr. Catherine Ferry has toured the coast looking for every single one of them. Why do people have these things?
It is a very English thing, it must be said. There are beach huts around the world, but I don't think anyone uses them in the same way that we do. It's quite an eccentric thing, and that's partly a nostalgic thing, I think. It's about people wanting to go back to their sort of bucket and spade holidays, but it also has a lot to do with our weather, I think, because a beach hut gives you somewhere to go and shelter if it starts to rain.
For the past 47 years, Jim and Beryl Francis have rented Beach Hut 126, a concrete chalet on what's affectionately known as Geriatrics Row.
They were built as beach changing chalets, and you paid your tuppence in old money and collected your basket, came up here and changed, put your clothes in the basket and took them down again. Then at the end of 1950s, they decided to let them make as beach chalets.
And your neighbours have been the same since then?
Well, a lot of them. There have been changes, you know. I mean, some of them have passed on.
Well, they're a bit bigger than the normal hut.
Well, this is at the back here.
Yeah?
There used to be windows.
Right. So you've got a little shelf there for your things.
Yeah, well, I made that.
Where'd you brew your tea?
Here.
Right.
This is where
the
we got
kettle.
Got the kettle at the back there.
So how many people actually use your hut then?
Well, we're retired and we can come down when we like, but my family comes down the weekend or when they come down on holiday. We like the seaside, we like the beach, we like swimming every day. Why go to Spain? Why go to the south of France when we got it all here? If the sun is shining, you couldn't do better.
Most beach huts are wooden, and at Lowestoft you can rent a plot and bring your own garden shed. So why is something so flimsy so fashionable?
We have the hut from April to October. I like the fact that when I walk down with the buggy that everything that we need is already here in the hut, so you're not constantly carrying lots of things backwards and forwards. If it's not a very nice day, then we'll just come and have games on the beach or just walk along and come and have a cup of tea.
It's that sense of community, the fact you belong to something and it's not really organised, it's just wonderful.
It's our home from home, the summer holidays.
We've only been here 8 years, but I see that we'll be handing this down to them and when we're old and they'll be making us cups of tea, maybe.
Well, it is quite a quirky English thing, I think. Once you've had one, you get hooked. And there's a real sense of community in beach huts that you don't necessarily find in your daily life anymore. You might move house several times in your life, but the beach hut will be a constant. And there are families I met at the end of Southampton Water at a place called Calshot Spit, and families have grown up together there. Their kids have grown up together. They'll have Christmas dinner in August in order that they can all be together. We're an island nation. I think there's something in our psyche about wanting to look out to sea, and what better place than a colourful hut. It's all about the view and location, location, location.
If beach huts are your thing, there's an opportunity for social climbing 11 miles further on at Southwold, the Mayfair of the Seaside Sanctuary.
You can have a beach hut here too, if you've got the odd 40 grand to spare.
But that's nothing compared to what some people spend to live here. With a house on the brink of toppling off the cliffs, no insurance and no local authority plan to save it, retired engineer Peter Boggis decided to take matters into his own hands. Known to the press as a self-appointed King Canute, he spent 2 years constructing his own sea defence.
And how much has disappeared into the sea?
Immediately opposite here, 180 metres have gone into the sea since the end of the war.
180 metres?
Yes, which is nearly half of the land holding. The area immediately here was largely gorse, but we also had tennis courts laid out on it for future pleasure. But all that has gone now. The end of the farm lane, where some 300 metres of land had been lost since the war, there were 12 houses have gone into the sea. And the most that I have ever seen is 22 metres of land going in 3 consecutive tides. So that's used as a holiday house now because it would be a little bit hairy living there during the winter. But if we hadn't started the work, it would have gone over the edge about 4 years ago.
So this is the front line where it was eating back from?
Yes.
Are you working down below here? Is this where you're
Further along.
What's going on?
Here we have a truck coming in. That will turn possibly here.
My God! What an incredible sight!
Yes. It's.
I can't believe it. I thought we were going to be looking down on a beach.
No, this is defending Britain.
An astonishing sight. There's just trucks and mud, and I'm absolutely stunned by the scale of it. I was expecting something far, far smaller.
Peter's defences are far more extensive than a load of homemade sandbags. He's organised up to 50 trucks a day to dump soil and clay at the base of the cliff. It's a mutually beneficial alliance with local contractors that helps them get rid of their waste. The bank has to be constantly topped up, as a third of it is washed away every year. Now, 2 years on, it's 500 metres long, and the retreat has been halted, for the time being. But it's not good news for everybody.
A certain amount of admiration in terms of the fact that he's taken it upon himself to protect his property, certainly. I think one of the concerns that we would have, and I'm sure a number of other local authorities have, is that if this is seen as a precedent, that others up and down the country might try to do the same thing. Southwold at the moment is suffering from the lowest beach levels in memory, and that's our biggest problem with what Mr. Boggess is doing. The cliffs that he is protecting, and it does sound rather a callous way of putting it, but that is the source of beach replenishment material for the beaches to the south.
From 1927 to 1947, the erosion rate here was almost zero. But as excessive sea defences were put in on adjacent areas, it caused a loss of the beaches, and as the beach levels progressively dropped, so the rates of erosion increased.
So by strengthening the coast each side of this particular section here, it's caused the erosion to increase?
Yes.
The council fears that Peter's earthworks prevent sand restocking the beaches. For Peter, the problems lie with the concrete seawalls in the town.
What actually happens with the concrete sea defence? It just eats around the edges, the sea, rather than going into it?
Well, with the concrete sea defence, it's very often the wave hits the sea defence, rebounds back off it with sufficient velocity to scour the beaches away.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So you lose the sand?
Yes, you lose the sand and protection in front of it.
It's difficult to pinpoint exactly where the problem lies, and that dilemma echoes all down the east coast. Defences seem to have a knock-on effect, shifting the force of erosion elsewhere. Undaunted by the ongoing dispute, Peter's battle with the council and with the advancing sea is one that is determined to win.
Quite a number of people have said that I'm mad, but I don't mind that at all. They would be mad too if the sea was nibbling away at the bottom of the garden with the blessing of the local council. It is our home and the homes of my neighbours. It is right to protect them.
Back on the beach, erosion or not, it's business as usual, and people young and old seem to be enjoying the coast while they can.
It's a lovely spade, isn't it? Digging into Australia.
There are some pretty remote spots on our coastline, places where, far from the gaze of the general public, secrets can thrive. Another product of longshore drift is Orford Ness. It's one of the biggest spits in Europe, 10 miles of bleak and isolated shingle, with ridges forming bizarre parallel striations on its surface.
For 70 years, Orford Ness is one of the most top-secret military establishments in Britain. So secret that even the villagers here at Orford Quay knew nothing about it. Thank you.
Almost totally disconnected from the mainland, the quickest way to get to the spit is to hop on a ferry. But as you chug your way across, you begin to get a sense of foreboding. Within minutes of crossing the water, you enter a mysterious landscape of weird structures, crumbling concrete and twisted steelwork. From 1913 onwards, a large part of the Ness was taken over by the military. It became their testing ground for a whole raft of what was then top-secret military developments, including parachutes, aerial photography and radar. These massive concrete structures are a relic of the time when Orford Ness was used to develop a far more sinister military device, Britain's atomic bomb. These places are even more bizarre on the inside than they are on the outside. Test laboratories like these were built to withstand accidental explosions. The walls are 3 meters thick, and the roofs are designed to absorb the energy and contain the debris of any blasts. Nuclear explosions were never a risk. The radioactive elements for the bomb were supposedly never brought here. But the bomb casings and the high explosive triggers had to be tested in vibration rigs and pressure chambers to check that the A-bomb could survive that final chilling plane journey to a potential target. No one was aware that the bombs being dropped on Orford were the casings and mechanisms of atom bombs. The MOD left the site in 1983, but what's happened here since is a heartening demonstration of nature's power to reassert herself. The redundant relics are slowly decaying and the plants and birds have returned. It's now home to nearly 280 species of birds and a rare floral treasure, the CP. Orford Ness is now a nature reserve. You can amble through the ruins on pathways that avoid disturbing the wildlife. At Felixstowe we begin to see a whole succession of sturdy defences from that other war, the one still raging between land and sea. Walton on the Naze deploys a different type of defence. Barges have been sunk along the shore to act as a baffle for the incoming tides. And at dear old Clacton-on-Sea, thousands of tons of Norwegian granite have been shipped in to create these fishtail-shaped groins, all designed to protect homes that are a stone's throw from the waves. Many of the East Coast defences had to be completely revamped because of one catastrophic event that shook the nation. On the freezing winter's night of January the 31st, 1953, a tidal surge had built up in the Atlantic. A deep depression, a strong north wind, and an extra high spring tide was sending a huge hump of water down the North Sea towards the east coast. Families from Lincolnshire all the way to London were about to experience our worst natural disaster in living memory.
It's only really, I suppose, when we got to school and realised that there was children that had died. I mean, that brings it home to you. You suddenly realise how lucky you are.
One of the things I can remember ever so well as a young person was they said, we'll take the dead people first. And for a 7-year-old kid, that was really quite a tragic thing to hear.
307 lives were lost. 40,000 people were made homeless. Canvey Island in Essex was one of the worst affected areas. The majority of the houses on Canvey were single-storey prefab bungalows lying at sea level. For 11,000 unsuspecting residents, there was little to suggest that disaster was about to strike.
My parents had gone to a dance, which was the opening of a war memorial hall that we had down here. And my elder sister Sheila and my cousin Valerie were looking after myself and my baby sister. And I think more or less Mum and Dad had come in my cousin said, Uncle Reg, you've got to get everybody up in the loft. There's a flood. And my mother said to her, don't be so bloody ridiculous. She said, stop telling porkies.
As we sort of got out of bed, we were straight into water, up to our knees and middle thigh. Gradually, my father realised that things were getting worse. So he sort of punched holes in the ceiling with his fists and pulled the ceiling lather and plaster down to expose the rafters.
It was a matter of putting a table and a chair and a puff and another chair, and we had to kind of climb up into the loft like that. Uncle was banging out on the old Joanna downstairs, and they were all singing Roll Out the Barrel and all the wartime songs, but you weren't aware of what was going on other parts of Canville.
The storm had swept town by town down the entire east coast. At 5 o'clock, while people settled in for the evening on Canvey, others were already drowning in Lincolnshire. By 9 o'clock, 10 people had drowned as floodwater swept through Great Yarmouth. With precious few telephones, no warning could be sent ahead, and worse was yet to come. When the waves reached Canvey just after midnight, a deluge burst through the limited banks of earth that defended the island. Residents of many single-storey homes had to cling desperately to their roofs outside. Huddled in their loft, Graham and his brothers sang hymns to raise their spirits, while his mother struggled with a pram in the perishing waters below.
My brother Keith, that was sitting next to me, he toppled into the water. And so my oldest brother there, Chris, he dived in after him and held him up for hours. Unfortunately, he'd been dead for quite a long time. My brother was just holding up a dead body. My mother, that was rocking the pram, she kept sort of saying to my dad, oh, the kid's all right, you know, I can't hear any noise, nothing's happening. So he said, it's all right, Anne, don't worry, they're asleep. But in fact, we thought about it afterwards, and what had happened, the water had seeped through the underneath of the pram, and they drowned in their pram.
Graham lost 3 brothers on that winter's night. All 160,000 acres of Canvey were flooded. 58 people died, many of them trapped in their own homes.
It was terrible, it was really awful. But as a 6-year-old, it was just part of life, I suppose.
After 1953, miles of seawall were repaired or replaced in the hope that a tragedy of this scale would be prevented in the future. But it's only a matter of time before another storm surge hits the coast. And because sea levels are rising, the risk of flooding is getting worse. Meanwhile, the cost of defending land from the sea is spiralling, which means that there are some tough decisions to be made. The Thames Barrier was a direct result of the 1953 floods. It's one of the largest and most expensive defences of all, designed to protect London from surge tides until 2030. Absolutely gigantic. This is what it takes to stop a capital city drowning. It's beautiful too. It's easy to forget how utilitarian engineering can look absolutely stunning. With the high tide mark creeping up on the city by 60 centimetres a century, even this has its limitations. Engineers are looking at extending its use until 2100 by raising the walls along the estuary by ½ a metre. And another option for the distant future is an even bigger barrier, further out into the estuary. There'll always be pressure to defend the nation's capital. But outside London, the costs are less easy to justify. Continuously replacing rock armour is like signing away a blank cheque to the sea. So in the Blackwater estuary, they're thinking about coastal defence in a whole new way. I'm cutting across the fields here at Abbots Hall Farm in Essex to have a look at an unconventional approach to coastal defence. Just down here,
On the edge of the Blackwater estuary, they're deliberately cutting holes in the sea wall.
Punching through the old defences seems like madness, but it's like opening a safety valve to take the pressure of erosion out of the estuary. This allows the water inland to create intertidal salt marshes. Nature's defence against the power of the sea.
What these salt marshes do, they take the energy out of the water. The tidal currents are forced to slow down as they move through the creek networks, and the salt marsh plants stick up into the water column and basically take the wave energy out of the wave.
Repairing old defences is a costly job. In the long run, creating man-made salt marshes can be much cheaper. But acres of farmland have to be given over to the buffer zone, so the scheme's not without its critics.
In people's minds, it probably does feel like we're in some way giving up, but we're not. What we're trying to do is work with nature so that when we do have another 1953 type event, we're prepared for it, and we have areas like this for water to be stored in terms of the flooding that goes on.
You're talking about a coastline that's going to be changing all the time, a map of the UK that'll look quite different in 100 years' time.
I think it's very interesting, the word coastline, because I think that what happened was, you know, we mapped our coastline and we put a line on it, and it's a snapshot forever of what the coast looked like when that person mapped that piece of coast. So it's very hard perception to change in people's mind that it isn't a fixed thing. It's a very dynamic place. Coastline's probably the most dynamic environments we've got in the UK, and it's constantly changing.
It may be a bitter pill to swallow, but we can't realistically protect every inch of our beloved coastline. Concrete walls do destroy the sense of wonder that draws us to the coast. But without them, we face a precarious future in the face of advancing seas. As you fall back into the open arms of the Thames estuary, the sweet smell of the English seaside returns to join us like a familiar friend. Here we can see a more forgiving side to the sea. Beautifully crafted cliffs, bays full of brilliantly painted beach huts, and above all, fun. When the sea takes away, somewhere she gives back. In Roman times, the sea at Reculver cut inland, turning the tip of Kent into an island. Now it's all silted up, and there are fields where there used to be water. Margate is perched on the tip of the North Kent coast and was a favourite spot of the artist Turner, drawn here by the quality of light and the vast skies. Probably Turner's best-known painting is the Fighting Temeraire. The great ship's neither being launched, nor is she in the middle of some great battle. She's being towed by a steam tug to the breaker's yard, up the Thames at Rotherhithe. But she was at the end of a glorious career, for the Temeraire was a man-o'-war second only to HMS Victory. She too played a pivotal, though somewhat forgotten role in the Battle of Trafalgar. It's a story of bravery that our historian Neil Oliver is piecing together on a replica frigate that would have fought alongside the Temeraire 200 years ago.
Temeraire would have towered above this, carrying 98 guns on 3 decks with another deck below her, and as many as 720 men. So it's a 3-storey building full of guns and men. Full of guns and men and boys, aged about 12, who'd also help run the ship. It was quite important to join the Navy at that age so you could learn the ropes. And they're also really useful for carrying the powder around in a battle and for working aloft where you needed to be really quick at working the sails. And that was really important to achieving superior seamanship.
The captain of the Temeraire was a wealthy landowner from Essex, Eliab Harvey.
he was an MP, which was quite a common thing for 18th century naval officers. We know he was a gambler, we know he was a bit of a loose cannon, and that was quite important and, well, quite a good thing to be in some respects in Nelson's navy. He wanted independent thinkers, he wanted courageous men, he wanted people who would say what they believed was right, and Harvey was one of those people.
The Temeraire was one of a fleet of 27 state-of-the-art British warships serving under Admiral Lord Nelson. On the 21st of October 1805, they finally confronted the French and Spanish navies in what would become the decisive battle of the Napoleonic Wars. We have an extraordinary personal insight into the events of the battle in the form of letters Captain Harvey wrote to his wife, Louisa.
As soon as the day appeared, the 21st, we saw their fleet, which proved to be 33 sail of the line French and Spanish, the rest frigates or smaller vessels. And altogether we had the advantage of the wind, and they showed no disposition to avoid our attack. It was noon before the action commenced, which was done according to the instruction given to us by Lord Nelson.
Nelson formed his most powerful ships into two lines to cut into the French and Spanish fleets. Leading the way was HMS Victory, closely followed by Harvey and the Temeraire.
We bore down upon the enemy in two columns. Nelson had sent to me and given me leave to lead and break through the enemy's line about the 14th ship. From this period for 2 hours we were so nearly engaged that I can give you no other account of this part of this most glorious day's work than what immediately concerned the Victory or myself.
HMS Victory came under fire from the enemy ship Redoutable. Through the smoke of the battle, Harvey spotted that the two ships were locked together in bitter fighting and sailed the Temeraire swiftly into the fray.
The Temeraire came alongside the French ship and poured in a broadside just as the French were preparing to board the Victory, and killed swathes of the Frenchmen and brought down the Redoutable's masts. And then the Temeraire's masts themselves fell back over the Frenchmen and they were lashed together, firing into each other with the Redoutable trapped between the Victory and the Temeraire. And the Redoutable, a very important ship for the French, was contained.
So this must be why the Temeraire has gone down in history, because of being effectively at the heart of the battle.
Yeah, I mean, it was a display of the heart of oaks, the courage, the discipline and the training of one ship that could then take on two of the French and still defeat them.
Do we have ideas about the death toll at the Battle of Trafalgar?
Well, we know on board the Temeraire that there were 47 dead and some 70 wounded, but it was much worse on the French ships. At a total death toll, the British lost up to about 500 men. There were many more injured, but the French, it was possibly 10 times that amount, and they actually piled up the dead behind the guns, and there were great piles of dead, and a lot of the officers that went on board the French ships were horrified by the scale of carnage.
There was barely time to recover from the battle before severe storms scattered the British fleet, and the damaged Temeraire was lashed by devastating wind and waves.
The state of the Temeraire is so bad we have been in constant apprehension of our lives, every sail and yard having been destroyed and nothing but the lower masts left standing.
Storms continued to rage. Communication was nigh on impossible. It was several days before Captain Harvey received word that Nelson had been killed.
The death of Lord Nelson we did not know until yesterday, by signal from the Dolphin, Captain Durham. How much must our country lament this gallant and valuable man? We have nothing like him to supply his place.
Harvey captained the stricken Temeraire to Gibraltar for repairs, eventually returning home a hero to be one of the pallbearers at Nelson's funeral. His role at Trafalgar was formally recognised by Parliament, and he was eventually knighted and promoted to Admiral. With her fighting days over, the Temeraire was finally sold as scrap in 1838. Turner was passionate about his painting, refusing to even lend what he called his darling out for exhibition. Although he was unlikely to have seen the Temeraire as she was towed to the breaker's yard, he painted the ship with the full splendour of her glory days and made her a national icon, as well as a naval legend. He was painting an epitaph, an act of farewell, not just to a great ship, but to an era, as sail gave way to steam and as memories of the golden age of Nelson receded. Turner's painting of the Temeraire has always been dearly loved. It has so much drama, so much emotion. Even as a hulk being towed away by a steam tug, the symbol of the future, at heart she was still complete, still indomitable, like the British spirit, the fighting Temeraire. Turner had never really wanted to sell the painting, but did at one point offer it to Captain Harvey's widow, Lady Louisa. She was said to have replied,
"What? Pay £200 for a work by a living artist? Certainly not."
So, what was to be Lady Louisa's loss became a national treasure.
"16 miles south of Margate, and at last, as the white cliffs come into sight, the end of the journey. For these last few miles, I want to step away from our coastline for the best vantage point of all.
Bit more swell out here.
Should get rough around the corner.
Don't say that, Simon. I'm falling out, yeah?
I've decided to compare notes with a fellow circumnavigator. Simon Osborne made his journey around the coast by kayak. It took him 82 days.
What's it like being out in a boat this tiny on the big open sea?
Sometimes it's very intimidating. When you're up against big cliffs like these, you sort of feel very small and insignificant. But you get to see every detail of the coastline. You're moving at about 4 miles an hour, so I get a long time to look at the white cliffs as we go past them and study them in detail. And it's amazing to land in small fishing ports and little villages and get an incredible welcome from the people, because they can see that you've come from the sea and in a very small boat.
In memory of his brother Mark, Simon took to the waters in 2002 to raise money for leukemia research. Kicking off from Aberystwyth, he paddled continuously for up to 12 hours a day, right around the British coast.
Do you think it made you look at Britain with fresh eyes?
It certainly has. I didn't realise Britain was as beautiful as it was until I did this trip. Some of the beaches up in Scotland, just incredible, and the cliff line up on the north coast of Scotland, and then some of the sandy beaches down the east coast are, in themselves beautiful as well. It's just so diverse. Amazing seeing the light on the cliff.
Oh, beautiful. Isn't that fantastic?
Very unique, aren't they?
Yeah, and for me it's completely mind-boggling. And I've just made this journey around the whole of the UK coastline, but I did it in complete luxury compared to you.
Hey. He says
until that weight comes up and clobbers me. And were there any tricky moments?
There were a few, mainly early on as I was learning and getting my sea legs. I found that if you set the small mental challenges, that was the way to get over it. So today we're setting the challenge, you get into this next headland, and then when you get there, you set yourself a new challenge, and it breaks the whole journey down.
Did you see bits of Britain that people don't normally get to?
I'm sure, yeah. I mean, the little caves and arches you can paddle through in these that you wouldn't be able to get a yacht through or any other boat. It's a great way to see the coastline, it really is.
It's only when we finally approach Dover Harbour, with the massive granite walls and ferries looming over us, that it properly dawns on me that the journey really is over. Dover Harbour itself is an impressive sight, whatever size of boat or ship you arrive in, and it has that familiarity that always makes you feel that you've come home, even if you've just been touring the UK.
Ramming speed.
In we go. Here we are. Thank you, Simon, for sharing the end of the journey.
No problem. It's a pleasure.
Good man.
Well done.
What a thrill. Dover's White Cliffs to Dover's White Cliffs, the full circumnavigation, completed in great style. I'm soaked, I'm cold, exhausted.
But you look happy.
Exhilarated. Here it is, the very place that I set out from all that time ago. I went in that direction and I've come back from that direction. I think it's the nature of epic journeys that the place you come back to looks just the same, but that you return an entirely changed person. And I know that's true for me. I've met people, I've seen places that I couldn't possibly have imagined. The UK coast is richer, it's more diverse, it's more astonishingly beautiful than I could have believed. I'm not sure now why I'd ever want to leave these shores again. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the star of the series, our coast.